My companion and I were on our way to a new restaurant on Church Street that had gotten good reviews. To get there, we had to pass one of the few nightclubs in Nashville, and as we were walking by, the front door suddenly swung open to let two guys out. Through the open door, we saw an impersonator dressed as Madonna on stage. My companion looked up at me. I don't understand. Why do they want to do this? Instantly, my thoughts returned to Mickey and Beth. 24 months ago, Brooklyn. I hate the bar scene, exclaimed I. Another search for female companionship had just ended in failure. Mickey only laughed, but I was serious. I'd been in a bar in Soho for less than an hour when some drunk girl abruptly turned around and spilled 2 glasses of beer on my shirt and pants. She apologized incoherently, and the bartender handed me a clean towel, but it was no use. There was nothing left for me to do but go to bed early and go back to my apartment. Riding the subway in this condition was so humiliating. No one would sit next to me. They must have taken me for a pissed-up waif. I could hardly stand the smell myself. When I finally reached my stop, I got a lot of stares at the station. People who ride the subway don't look at you, at least not directly, but I was still aware that I was attracting attention. I just hoped that no one I knew would be around. It's very rare to see anyone you know in New York City, but I figured I was just lucky today. When I finally made it to my apartment, I barely managed to get my keys out of my soaked pockets. Mickey must have heard me because the door suddenly opened and he was standing there, filling the entire entryway. "Well, aren't we having a party?" he exclaimed cheerfully. I didn't really appreciate his humor, but you don't really want to gape at a guy who's 6 feet tall, even if he's a drag queen. I moved to the Big Apple 18 months ago, fresh out of engineering school. I have a master's degree in computer science with a specialization in security systems. Thanks to some unknown but benevolent deity, I landed my dream job at Google right out of e-school. Not only did they offer me an amazing starting salary, but they also arranged for me to move to New York City from Nashville, my hometown. My classmates envied me, and I felt pretty good about it too, at least until I started looking for a place to live. I figured I could get a nice apartment in Manhattan on my new salary. When I started looking through the classifieds, I found that my assumption was correct, if I was willing to share a place with 5 other people. I checked a few of the ads I could afford. The best one offered a bedroom the size of a small walk-in closet. The worst, well, I won't even attempt to describe it, but you can find a description in Dante's Divine Comedy by looking in Inferno. Suffice it to say, after a few research trips, all I wanted to do was hide in my hotel room. This boy was in culture shock. "You're doing it all wrong," my Google colleagues advised me. "You can forget about your own place. You can't afford it. And forget about living in Manhattan, unless you're willing to live in a high-crime neighborhood. You need to look in other neighborhoods. Try Brooklyn, all the young professionals there. You'll still have to have roommates, but at least there won't be so many that you'll have trouble learning their names. Craigslist is a good place to start." Just like that, I found myself on a Brooklyn street a mile from the nearest subway station, looking for an address. The street was lined with charming old houses, each with a porch at the entrance, and all shaded by mature sycamores. But I'd been warned that I wouldn't find anything there. Yuppies had bought up all the houses, gotten busy remodeling them, and resold them at high prices. I could buy a mansion in Nashville for what one of these remodeled brownstones was worth. I turned the corner onto a commercial street and almost missed the address. Right next to the restaurant next door was a regular doorway facing the street. The number painted on it had faded over time, and I had to go back twice to find it. Once I found it, I walked down a long hallway that led me to a landing. The apartment I was looking for was on the 2nd floor. The ad sounded good, and the rent was high but affordable. When I responded to the email with the ad, I was given an appointment to see the apartment and meet the tenants, Mickey and Beth. I wondered if they were a couple, but the ad said 3 bedrooms. As I knocked on the door, I saw an eye in the peephole looking at me, and then the door opened and a slender, attractive young woman in a skirt over a bathing suit stood before me. I thought. Perhaps it's not so bad. Are you Peter Morrison? She asked gruffly. Yes, I'm Peter, I replied. And you must be Beth. I'm here to see how things are going with the apartment lease. She frowned slightly when I spoke, and I wondered if my southern accent was interrupting her, but she only gestured for me to come in. I started to ask her a question, but she waved me away. You need to talk to Mickey. We walked out of the short hallway into a decent-sized living room. Sitting on the couch was a man I assumed was Mickey. As Beth and I walked in, he stood up and kept rising. He was 6 feet 5 inches tall. Even in a room with a high ceiling, he towered. I became worried. If he had a temper or was difficult to get along with, he could be an intimidating roommate. But I relaxed as he politely started showing me around, pointing out the various attributes of the place. And it was great, more beautiful than anything I'd seen so far. I guess the unassuming entrance deterred developers and lowered rents. At any rate, I liked the place. I was even more excited when I saw the sleeping quarters. The apartment originally had 2 bedrooms, but the larger one had been divided into 2 smaller rooms. To my surprise, Mickey and Beth wanted me to take the larger bedroom. The reason for their generosity became clear when they explained what my share of the rent would be, 60% of the total. Nevertheless, I could afford it, and it seemed like a real opportunity that I was seeing for the first time. When we got back to the living room, however, I realized that my decision wasn't necessarily a big deal. They started asking me about my job, background, interests, and lifestyle. I patiently answered their questions, but it really felt like I was being interviewed to join some exclusive club. After another 20 minutes, Mickey suddenly stood up and started strutting around. Even though he was at the other end of the room, I still felt like he was towering over me. You seem like a nice enough guy, he said. I just have one question. Are you gay? What? Stammered I. No, of course not. I wondered what I had done to give him that impression. Oh, he said. That's too bad. Beth and I looked at them both in surprise. This man who looked like he could play soccer and a graceful young woman who looked like a dancer were gay? Then I noticed that they were both looking at me, clearly waiting for my reaction. I realized that if I wanted to live in this apartment, my next words would be crucial. I'm not gay, I repeated, but I hope you won't judge me for it. They looked at each other. Then Mickey burst out laughing, and Beth smiled cheerfully. Okay, he said. I guess you can be our token lodger? After that, we all relaxed and they welcomed me into their little home. Turns out I was right about Beth. She was a dancer. Of course, that wasn't what she did for a living. Her full-time job was as a waitress in an upscale Brooklyn restaurant. By day, she spent long hours in a dance studio or auditioning for Broadway musicals. She landed a few roles in the chorus, but they weren't lucrative enough to pay her rent. But an even bigger surprise was that Mickey was also a dancer, only he danced at the club as a female impersonator. I went to see him a couple times, and there was something about this huge man in makeup, dress, and heels that was both hilarious and convincing. On weekends, he was a regular at a Greenwich Village club, and during the day, he worked as a barista at Starbucks. I soon realized that even though I was thrilled when I came to see their apartment, they were both desperate for a roommate, especially someone who could pay more than half the rent. So we began to feel comfortable with each other. Soon I was used to seeing Mickey in lipstick and eyeshadow. And if Beth occasionally had a woman over to stay the night, I politely ignored her in the mornings when I made myself breakfast. As for me, I think in Beth and Mickey's eyes, I had become something between a pet and a zoo animal. I'm exaggerating, of course, but they were genuinely fascinated by me for several reasons. For one, I was straight. Their last 2 roommates had been gay, so a straight male was new to them. Added to that was the fact that I was a native Southerner, a creature they had seen on TV but had never met in real life. My Southern accent constantly amused them both. All in all, it was a learning experience for the 3 of us. Working at Google was also a learning experience. There were highly intelligent people working there, full of energy and ideas. I considered myself pretty smart when I graduated from engineering school, but at Google, I quickly realized that I was just one of the crowd. For the first few months, I felt like an imposter. I didn't know people, I didn't know procedures, and I felt like I was running at the tail end of the herd trying to catch up with everyone else. But gradually, I started to contribute to the team I was assigned to, and after 6 months, I thought I would do well. One of my requirements in my new job was periodic trips to the company's headquarters in California. Visiting Google's headquarters in Mountain View was exciting at first, but after a few trips, the novelty quickly wore off. A direct flight from JFK Airport to San Jose takes about 6.5 hours. With a tailwind, the return flight usually takes about 5 hours, but 3 hours are lost due to time zones. So by the time you make your final approach over Jamaica Bay, it's usually very late. Still, they're waiting for you in the office by 9 the next morning. As a result of all this, my personal life has suffered. Or at least it would have suffered if I had a personal life. The stereotype of an engineer is the nerd who is a bit meticulous. I'd like to think I'm the exception that proves the rule. Not that I was voted most outgoing on campus, but I was definitely socially active during my undergraduate years, or at least as active as I could be while still getting excellent grades. I didn't find my soulmate, but I was actively looking for one. All of that came to a screeching halt in May of my senior year. My parents were driving down the highway for graduation when a drunk lost control of his car, crossed the dividing lane, and crashed head-on into them. They were killed instantly. At the age of 21, I suddenly found myself alone with the world. And I had already been accepted to graduate school for engineering, but there was no way I was going to get in that fall. Instead, I spent the next 9 months in a daze, making funeral arrangements, attending the trial of a drunk driver who miraculously survived, settling and mourning my parents. Except for occasional dinner invitations from sympathetic friends of my parents, socializing disappeared from my radar screen. MIT was sympathetic. They held me back until the following year, when I was finally able to pull myself together. By then, I had sold the family home and closed a chapter of my life in Nashville. I would miss my friends and familiar surroundings, but I was glad I was able to get my mind off the sad memories of my hometown. I headed to Cambridge. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I immersed myself in my studies, only occasionally going out for a beer with my classmates. And since the male-to-female ratio among engineers was very unbalanced, I had few opportunities to meet people. By the time I graduated, I was more than ready to reconnect, and I hoped that moving to New York would allow me to do just that. The city was teeming with attractive young women, I had heard, and I assumed I had good prospects. I was wrong. It wasn't that there weren't plenty of available women. They just weren't what I was looking for. For starters, many of them were older than me, often by 10 to 20 years. In principle, I had no problem with older women, but the main characteristic of those I met was an aura of urgency. They were looking for a potential husband and didn't want to waste any time. I was often invited to share a bed with them, and that was fine, but the conversations after the fun usually revolved around my future plans, thoughts of children, and other uncomfortable questions I wasn't prepared to answer. Of course, in addition to those too eager to have fun, there were plenty of women my age. Unfortunately, most of them I encountered seemed to be on their way to becoming alcoholics. The women I encountered in bars were halfway to intoxication by the time I struck up a conversation. The ones I asked out seemed to need a couple of stiff drinks before they could relax. Parties seemed like just an opportunity for them to get drunk as hell. My encounter with a drunk woman in Soho who gave me a beer bath was the last straw. Complaining about your personal life to a gay drag queen might seem like a waste of time, but Mickey and I had become friends, so when I got home in the early evening and changed, he listened patiently as I poured out my frustrations. When I finally took a breath, he shook his head. "You're doing it all wrong, man," he said. "If you keep trying to meet women in bars, the only thing you'll have in common is alcohol." Taking my hand, he led me into his bedroom to the tiny desk where his computer stood. "Here's something you should try," he said, typing a URL into his browser. A site called iContact opened up. "A computer dating service?" I asked doubtfully. You've got to be kidding me. No, kid. You've got it all wrong, Mickey assured me. Sure, a lot of services are pretty cheesy, but this one is different. I know some of the guys who work there. I looked at him skeptically. In the end, I let Mickey talk me into giving it a try. Hell, I thought. It can't be any worse than what I've been going through lately. Mickey was right when he said this service was different. The first difference I noticed was the cost. The initial fee for an annual membership was much higher than I expected. What kind of ripoff is this? Protested I, turning to my huge friend. Don't you get it? He asked. It's an elite site. They purposely set their rates high to prevent hit and runs. Yeah, but it's too much to pay for a service I haven't even seen advertised, I replied. Exactly, he said smugly. They're not targeting the mass market, they're targeting a more exclusive clientele. Maybe I was tired, or maybe there really wasn't much sense in his argument. Whatever the case, I entered my credit card information and pressed enter, hoping I hadn't thrown money away. And the next screen brought up a questionnaire that I was to fill out. But where other services ask you to describe the perfect woman, as if any of us really know her until we see her, eye contact asked questions about me, my background, my job, my interests. I had taken several psychological tests before, and these questions seemed similar in nature. While I was working on the seemingly endless questionnaire, Beth came into the room and studied my answers over my shoulder. That's about what I expected, she muttered reproachfully. I wondered exactly which answer she disapproved of, but since Beth seemed to disapprove of men in general, it was hard to tell. In any case, when I reached the bottom of the screen and pressed enter, I suddenly realized I was done. The next requirement was a photo. I didn't have any pictures with me, but Beth hid in her room and came back with a digital camera. She fiddled with my hair a bit, adjusted a few lampshades to improve the lighting, and took a few pictures. While she reviewed her work, I tried to peek over her shoulder, but she waved me away. Well, I demanded, how do I look? Almost human, she snapped back. Nevertheless, she downloaded one of the pictures to my computer, and when I looked at it, I decided it wasn't too bad. I then downloaded it to include it in my eye contact profile. An instruction box appeared, prompting me to save the profile. When I looked at it perplexed, Mickey said, "That way, you can review your responses in the future and make changes if you want to." That made sense, and I saved a copy on my hard drive. So now what? I asked. Just wait, Mickey advised. It's about to get cool. After a minute or two, the profiles of 3 women suddenly appeared on the screen. Each had a picture with a headshot and a brief description underneath. My eyes widened. All 3 women were very attractive, and a cursory scan of their profiles indicated that they might indeed be interesting to meet. The bottom half of the screen asked me to view each of the women's profiles and then rate them on several criteria, including appearance, general interests, and overall attractiveness. I clicked on the first one. This was going to be fun. As I was ranking, I heard Mickey and Beth whispering behind me. I also heard a few chuckles. As I filled out all 3 questionnaires, the screen asked me to rate each woman in terms of dating suitability. Tell me which one you would most like to ask out on a date. Damn, I thought. All 3 look way better than most of the women I've met lately. But I dutifully looked through each one to make sure of my preferences. When I finally arranged them in 1, 2, 3 order, I heard Beth speak up behind me. I told you, pay up, asshole. Mickey fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a $5 bill, which he reluctantly held out to her. How do you do that? He asked her. You're not only gay, you're not even the same sex. Beth only smiled serenely. While this little interaction was going on, I kept my eyes on the screen to see what would happen next. Nothing happened. I turned to Mickey again. So here's the deal. How do I get in touch with her? When do I get her number? I asked. You don't, he said with a smirk. They're just models. They're not real. Before I could get upset, Mickey directed me back to the monitor. A new screen displayed a message for me. Thank you for passing the initial screening. Within 24 hours or less, eye contact will provide you with profiles of 3 users who best match your tastes and interests based on the information you provided. This time, however, you will receive the contact information of all three. Please feel free to contact any of them, all of them, or none of them, however you prefer. Eye contact will continue to update and refine your profile based on your preferences to find the perfect match for you. Thank you for choosing eye contact. That's it, I demanded, turning my chair to face Mickey. No lists? No photo galleries? I'm just waiting for someone to pick me? Exactly, man, he said, folding his arms. That's all there is to it. But you just wait. By this time tomorrow, I think you'll be overwhelmed. By tomorrow, I thought to myself, I'll be barking at myself for letting Mickey drag me into this scam. But he had already gone back into the living room to watch TV, and I turned to Beth questioningly. She only smiled patronizingly at me as if I were a child. Be patient, Petey, she said. Just be patient. The next morning I went to work as usual, but I couldn't stop thinking about eye contact. Part of me kept wondering if it was just an elaborate scam to separate me from my free money. But another part of me couldn't wait to see who the system would find for me. I desperately wanted to log into eye contact at the office and see who was waiting for me, but Google scrutinizes all network connections made from its virtual private network and discourages the use of personal information. Of course, I was well aware of the company's security capabilities, so I wasn't going to take any chances. It would have to wait until I got home. When I got back to the apartment, both Beth and Mickey were already there, and they must have known what I was thinking, because they both followed me to my desk when I turned on my computer and logged into eye contact. I should have been angry at their curiosity, but since they both already knew everything I was doing, I decided that another invasion of my privacy wouldn't change anything. The welcome screen read, "Good evening, Peter. Welcome to eye contact." Very cool, I thought, to customize the greeting depending on the system clock. We have 3 suggestions for your consideration. The first was chosen to be a red-haired girl with a very cute face. Judging from her profile, she worked as a copywriter at an advertising agency on Madison Avenue. Very nice, I thought. Sounds like she'd be really interesting to meet. I clicked on the second selection and saw a tall brunette photographed in front of an oil painting. Sure enough, her profile listed her as working at a trendy art gallery in the village. I imagined Sunday trips with her to museums and long conversations over dinner in cozy little restaurants. Definitely attractive. Damn, I thought. That's pretty cool. Both options look very promising. Then I clicked on number 3 and, oh my gosh, look at her. The picture only showed her face, but what a face. She had raven hair falling to her shoulders, framing dark eyes and high, prominent cheekbones. Surely she must be a model, I thought. I quickly scanned her profile and learned that she was actually an investment banker. Her interests and preferred occupations seemed similar to my own. She was, I learned, a year older than me, but that didn't present any problem, especially when I looked at her picture again. Beth leaned on my shoulder, and I heard her sigh. Shit, she muttered. I'd have had her. I grabbed my mouse and hovered over the button with her contact info, but Mickey reached down and stopped me. Hey, slow down, cowboy. Are you sure you want to pick her for your first time? No offense, dude, but I think she might be out of your league. For the first time since I'd met him, I pounced on Mickey. Back off, dude. You're the one who pushed me to sign up for this service. If eye contact thinks we're a good fit, I'll go along with it. He held up his hands reassuringly. Sure, Peter, no problem. I just don't want you to get burned. I clicked on the contact information and saw her name, Susan Devereux, and apparently a cell phone number and email address. I started to click on the latter, but this time Beth intervened. Wait a minute, Peter. You're not going to send her an email, are you? Well, I said a little shyly, I thought it would be a nice, non-threatening way to introduce myself. Beth snorted. Like that's going to impress her. A letter from some guy she's never heard of. You could say something like, Hi, my name is Peter, and I'm a jerk. Okay, I said in annoyance. What would you do? First of all, she said, I'd call her. At least that way she can make sure it's a real person and not some Viagra salesman. And if she agrees to meet with you, what are you going to ask her? Continued Beth. Well, I stammered, I was probably going to ask her to dinner on Saturday. No, 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 scolded Beth. First of all, a girl like that almost certainly already has a date for Saturday night. You don't want to get rejected the first time you call her. And if she doesn't have a date, you don't want to force her to admit it. That's not good either. Okay, then what should I do? I asked in desperation. Call her and ask her if she'll be in town next Monday. If she's traveling on business, it's probably midweek, so she'll probably be free on Monday. And if she's not going, she'll at least be impressed that you cared enough to ask. And then what? Demanded I. Then you ask her if there's a place near her office where you could meet her for an after-work drink and get to know her better. But I'm trying to get away from the bar life, I protested. Just shut up and listen, she said, but smiled slightly so I wouldn't misunderstand her. First, by letting her pick her own place, you'll increase her sense of security. She'll be on her turf, not yours. Second, if you turn out to be a total loser, it will be easy for her to escape, either by going back to the office or going home. By giving her an easy escape route, you'll reduce her anxiety level about you. That makes sense, I thought. Third, Beth continued, if you do manage to get a relationship going, you'll still be in a place she likes, and the drinking can turn into dinner if she feels like it. Damn, I said admiringly. Are you sure you're not straight, Beth? You've got it all figured out. I've picked up my share of chicks, she said, pretending to polish her nails. Okay, I said. I sold out. Now shut up and let me make a call. I grabbed my droid phone, but before I called, I entered Susan's name and number into my phone's address book. Aren't you getting a little ahead of yourself, dude? Asked Mickey. For luck, I replied. Then I pressed connect. I was pleasantly surprised when she actually answered. Honestly, I didn't believe it would work. Hell, I'm not sure I believed she was real. Her voice was low and throaty, yet very feminine. It matched her image perfectly. I introduced myself and then played up the conversation as Beth advised. To my amazement, it worked. She agreed and suggested a place downtown, not far from her office. I told her I'd be there around 7 o'clock, and after talking some more, we agreed. I got up from my chair, turned around, and knelt at Beth's feet. Salute your infinite wisdom, O goddess of the dating world, I said, as solemnly as I could without bursting into laughter. She wasn't impressed. I would have enjoyed it a lot more if she had been there instead of you. All weekend, I pondered our meeting. I kept thinking about what I should wear and rehearsing possible topics of conversation. In short, I was acting like a high school freshman on a first date. Come on, hang in there, I told myself several times. It's not like you haven't done this 100 times before. But I had to admit, I'd never had a date that intrigued me as much as this one did. When Monday morning came, Mickey was already up, and I went outside to make myself breakfast. As I headed for the door, he stopped me. Look, kid, just relax and be yourself. Everything's going to be fine. As I walked to the subway station, I laughed to myself. Just be yourself. That's pretty ironic advice coming from a guy who likes to dress like a woman. But I knew he was right. If only I could take his advice. Throughout the day, I had imagined a dozen scenarios that would have prevented me from getting downtown to the place Susan had suggested, but none of them happened, and a cab did indeed deliver me at 7 o'clock. I entered the establishment, which was quiet and tasteful, and looked around for her. She was nowhere to be seen. Uh-oh. I sat down at the bar and started to prepare myself to face a no-show, but as soon as I ordered my drink, I was grabbed by someone's hand. Peter? She said, and there she was, already appearing, looking even better in reality than she did in the picture. The rest of her body matched her face perfectly. She was tall and slender, with long legs and stilettos. Thank you, eye contact, I thought to myself. We introduced ourselves and she pulled my hand. Come on, let's go sit in a booth where we can talk and get to know each other better. From that point on, the conversation flowed and didn't stop. I didn't have time to be nervous because I was too engrossed in what she had to say and sharing my thoughts. When there was finally a pause in the conversation, I realized it was 8:30. I didn't realize it was that late, I said. Would you like to order dinner so we can continue our conversation? Oh, I was hoping you'd suggest that, she immediately replied. I silently thanked Beth. We ordered a light dinner and continued our conversation as if we had known each other for years. She was interesting. She was funny. She was everything I thought I was looking for. I wasn't sure what impression I made on her, but at least she didn't leave me. I was a little upset when I checked my phone and saw that it was 11 o'clock. I apologized for keeping her so late on a weeknight and offered to get her a cab. We walked out to the sidewalk and I stopped the cab. When I opened the door for her to get in, she stopped me. You're very different from the men I usually see, she told me. Good different or bad different? I asked apprehensively. A good difference, she said with a smile. I decided to try my luck. Good enough for you to want to do it again someday? I asked. Definitely, she replied. Call me next week. With those words, she kissed me on the cheek and slid into the cab, the hose on her long legs glistening in the light of the street lamps. I got home around midnight, but I'm not sure exactly how I got there. Maybe I caught a cab, or maybe I just levitated the whole way. What a marvelous evening. Showing incredible restraint, I waited until Monday rather than Sunday of the following week to call her. But as soon as I heard that throaty voice on the other line, I was at a loss for words again. Hi, I said. Are you still interested in getting together this week? And immediately mentally kicked myself. That's no way to sound decisive and confident, I thought. Sure, she said. Let's do it. I thought I detected a less than enthusiastic note in her voice. Nevertheless, she didn't refuse. What day is good for you? I asked. I mentally kicked myself again. Good for you. You just let her know you don't have anything else going on in your life. Friday will do, she replied. Great, I said, a little too enthusiastic. Then I finally capitulated to the recklessness. Is there anything in particular you like to do? As soon as those words flew off my lips, I realized I had failed. How pathetic is that? I asked myself. We've only dated once and I'm already out of ideas. She's going to want to back out of this date before we even meet. Indeed, I thought I heard a note of impatience in her voice, though it could have just been my imagination. All she said was, "Surprise me." I can do that, I said, with a lot more confidence than I felt, and after a few more minutes of talking, we scattered. When I looked up, Mickey was looking at me strangely. You're sweating, Peter, he said in a concerned voice. I shook my head sadly. I blew it, Mickey. I had a big chance, and I think I've already blown it. How can I surprise a sophisticated, intelligent woman like her? With those words, I told him the whole sad story, including the need to come up with something creative and surprising. Like a good sport, he sat with me and tried to come up with an idea, but nothing much came through. But at the lowest point of my fears, a little voice spoke inside me. This is your only chance. Go big or go home. And in that moment, I decided that if I was going to strike out, I was going to go for it with a swing. Then it hit me, and I turned to my huge friend. Mickey, you have to help me. He listened to my request, and a wide grin appeared on his face. Okay, Peter, I'll do it. It'll be fun. I can't promise you it'll work out, but I can promise you she won't forget you. I decided that was all I could ask for. On Thursday, I called Susan again to remind her of our date. Meet me outside your office, I told her, and we'll start there. Where are we going? She asked. It's a surprise, I said. Remember? Susan came down from the office around 6:30 the next evening, and I met her in the lobby. Giving her a quick kiss on the cheek, I walked her to the sidewalk and then caught a cab. Once we were seated, I leaned back in the seat and told the cabbie, Grand Central Station. Susan looked at me strangely. I just smiled at her. Once we arrived, I led her through the main concourse and up the stairs to the mezzanine. We found some chairs overlooking the convention and settled into them. After sitting like that for a minute or two, Susan couldn't hold back any longer. "What are we doing, Peter?" I glanced at the big clock below us, then smiled at her. "People watching," I said. "Don't you like people watching?" She stared at me. "Well, yes," she agreed. "But—" "Take that guy, for example," I interrupted her, pointing to a tall man in a fedora and a long coat that reached almost to the floor. He was walking in our direction, and after reaching a point almost directly below us, he suddenly stopped. As the crowd of people around him continued to walk by, he removed the backpack he was wearing and set it on the floor. Opening the top of the backpack, he climbed inside and began fiddling with the contents. Suddenly, a rhythm echoed through the hall. Then we heard Lady Gaga's voice singing, "My mom used to tell me when I was little, we're all born superstars." She twirled my hair and tinted my lips, in the glass in her boudoir. As soon as those words were spoken, the stocky figure suddenly stood up to her full height and threw off her coat and hat, exposing a platinum blonde wig and a silver lame dress shod in high-heeled shoes. Despite the bright red lipstick and false eyelashes, there was no doubt that this impossibly tall blonde was a man. It was Mickey. He started dancing to the music, somehow keeping perfect timing despite his 4-inch heels. "Oh, I don't have it any other way, but baby, I was born this way." We saw many passers-by stop and stare at Mickey. Suddenly, in one concerted movement, about 20 of them dropped their coats to reveal matching costumes. Then they headed towards him and started dancing around him, singing along to the music. The song transitioned into a spoken part, and Mickey began to spin in a circle, wiggling his finger for the crowd's edification. "Don't be a drag, just be a queen. Don't be a drag, just be a queen." People all over Congress were doubled over with laughter at the sight of a giant transvestite vamping and chanting. I risked a glance at Susan. She was laughing so hard that tears were rolling down her cheeks while clapping and singing along. As the song came to an end, the dancers dispersed and began to blend into the crowd, leaving Mickey alone. When the last chorus came on, he began to walk up the stairs towards us, humming as he did so. "I was born this way. I was born this way. I'm on the right track, baby. I was born this way." He reached us just as he finished the last line, plopped into my lap, and smacked me on the cheek. There was dead silence for a moment, and then the hall erupted in joyous shouts and applause. Mickey stood up and bowed to the crowd as much as he could in his tight dress, and then turned to us. "Susan," I said, "meet my friend Mickey. Mickey, this is Susan." Jimmy leaned over to kiss her cheek. "So, what do you think?" he asked her. "It was just amazing," she replied. "At first I couldn't understand what was happening, and then I couldn't believe it was really happening. I've never seen a flash mob live. What a thrill." Afterward, we went to Mickey's club, eating and drinking while watching the performances. Susan had never been there before and really enjoyed it. She was fascinated by Mickey and thought his friends were cute. She was laughing and smiling the whole time. When we got ready to leave, she put me in a cab and gave the driver an address on the Upper West Side. Once up on the floor, she rushed almost jogging to her door, opened it with her key, and dragged me inside. There were probably other people in the apartment, but I didn't have a chance to see or greet them as she pulled me into her bedroom and closed the door behind us. We collapsed on the bed and got down to it. The next morning, after we got dressed, she took me into the kitchen where her roommates were making brunch. I felt a little awkward. There was no way they couldn't have heard us. But Susan nonchalantly introduced me to Missy and Brianna, who seemed completely unperturbed by my appearance. After we ate, it was time for me to leave. Susan took the elevator down with me and stayed on the curb while the doorman hailed a cab. She kissed me goodbye and then looked intently into my eyes. "Last night was wonderful. All of it. Call me." I had no problem promising to do so. As I was getting into the cab, she leaned over and said, "Surprise me again." Then she turned to go back inside, and the cabbie drove off into traffic. Thus began our affair. The intervals between our meetings rapidly decreased until my trips to Mountain View and her trips to Boston were the only interruptions. The degree of commonality between our interests and tastes was truly remarkable. I considered writing a review for Eye Contact. If there was any downside to our relationship, it was the self-deprecation I felt about having to seek out new experiences to surprise Susan. She enjoyed them and always looked forward to the next one. I tried to diversify them. One day I took her to Fort Tryon Park on the Hudson River to see the cloisters. Everyone who lives in New York went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but surprisingly, few people visit the cloisters, which is a branch of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She loved the art on display at the museum, but she loved walking through the gardens and colonnades even more. She thinks it's a magical place. Another time I surprised her by taking her on a Circle Line boat cruise around Manhattan. She had never done that before and really enjoyed playing tourist. I think we were the only passengers on board that day who spoke English. Beth helped me get tickets to an avant-garde dance performance. The music was very strange, and I had no idea what the dancing meant, but Susan loved it, and I got big points for taking her along. As time went on, I started spending more and more time at Susan's apartment. In essence, we were living together. Her roommates were so used to seeing me that they paid almost no attention to me. Sometimes, though, I caught them making snide remarks when they thought I wasn't around. Of course, I took Susan to my place in Brooklyn, too, but she didn't feel comfortable there. I could understand that. Her apartment was much nicer and had more amenities, but it also seemed to me that she and Beth didn't get along. There was nothing hostile about it, but they never seemed to warm up to each other. I wondered if Susan didn't like Beth because she was a lesbian, or if Beth didn't like Susan because she was disappointed that Susan was straight. Hampton. One Friday afternoon, we rented a car and drove to the Hamptons to spend the weekend with her parents. As we pulled onto the Long Island Expressway, I became increasingly nervous. I knew Susan's parents were fairly well-to-do people, and I wondered what they would think of me. My anxiety didn't diminish when Susan told me to turn onto the paved driveway that led to an oval curve in front of a mansion that could only be called a mansion. I fully expected to see Jay Gatsby coming out of the door. "Mom, Dad, we're here!" Susan called out as I dragged our bags into the front hallway. Mr. and Mrs. Devereux came out of the back room at her voice and greeted their daughter lovingly before shaking my hands. Mrs. Devereux, please call me Elaine, was a tall, attractive woman, although she had clearly put on weight and had undergone several plastic surgeries. She took my hands lightly and exchanged air kisses with me. I tried not to touch her face. Walter Devereux was stocky, but he looked like he'd been that way all his life. His thinning hair, slicked back, was graying, giving him the appearance of a distinguished man. Though he was well into his 60s, his handshake was firm. The trip was a long one, and since we stopped for a snack along the way, it was quite late by the time we arrived. So after a short conversation, we were escorted upstairs to our bedrooms. Susan went to her old room and I was escorted to the guest bedroom. Mrs. Devereux informed us that breakfast would be served at 8 o'clock in the sunroom. Then they wished us good night. Susan giggled and waved and then disappeared into her room. I prepared for bed, wondering what the next day would bring. Before I could turn off the light, the bedroom door opened and Susan slipped in. She was wearing a nightgown, and she threw back the covers and lowered herself down beside me. "Should we do this?" I asked anxiously. "What if?" There were no words after that. It doesn't take much imagination to realize what happened next. When I woke up the next morning, I was alone in bed. Checking the time, I found it was 7:30, so I hurriedly got up, showered and shaved, remembering Mrs. Devereux's breakfast schedule. At 5 minutes past 8, I found myself in the sunroom, a large glass-walled room that overlooked the pool. "It's good of you to join us," Mr. Devereux said, and I wasn't sure if he was welcoming me or reproaching me for being late. Over breakfast, which I thought could have easily fed twice as many people, Walter outlined the plans for the day. "I thought we might enjoy a light lunch by the pool today. Then we'll take a drive around the neighborhood so Susan can see how much has changed. In the evening, we'll have dinner at the club." I was disappointed. Sure, I had nothing else to do, but I had hoped to be able to spend time with just Susan. However, that did not appear to be the case this weekend. After a leisurely breakfast, Walter and Elaine gave us a tour of the house and grounds. When we arrived last night, I immediately realized the house was huge, but as we walked down the long hallways and huge rooms, I was amazed. Their dining room alone was bigger than my entire apartment in Brooklyn. If they walk through this place regularly, I thought, how can they gain weight? After the tour, we all went back to our rooms to change. I pulled on an old pair of shorts and a t-shirt, then headed barefoot across the lush grass to the pool. This time, only Walter beat me to it. He was shirtless, and his potbelly hung over the top of his swimsuit. He positioned himself under the cabana in the shade, and under his arm was a large jug of what I recognized were screwdrivers. Then the ladies appeared. Elaine in a one-piece suit designed to hide her extra weight, Susan in a bikini capable of arousing a dead man. I was a little surprised that she had chosen such a daring outfit to appear before her parents, but they only smiled indulgently at their daughter and made themselves comfortable. It soon became clear that the pool and tanning bed were for the ladies. While they sunbathed there, Walter and I stayed under the cabana, sipping screwdrivers. He was already finishing his second, and I was finishing my first. While we were relaxing, he started talking about the current political situation. I was a guest, and I'd like to think a fairly intelligent person, so I kept my mouth shut and just listened. Politically, I consider myself a moderate person, maybe a little right of center. As I listened to Walter, I realized that he was somewhere to the right of Genghis Khan. He went on at length about what was wrong with the country and what needed to be done to fix it. I just sat in silence while he ranted, occasionally biting my tongue on some of his outrageous statements. At one point, I mentally pictured introducing him to Mickey and Beth and had a hard time suppressing a laugh at that unlikely scene. Because of the warm sun and more alcohol than I usually drink, I found myself becoming quite drowsy. Apparently, I wasn't the only one, because after snacking on the canapes we had brought, we all headed inside for an afternoon nap. I had only planned to take a nap for a few minutes, but when I woke up, I was surprised to find that it was already the middle of the day. When I got dressed and went downstairs, Walter, who didn't appear to be the least bit affected by the screwdrivers he'd drunk, sat us down in his Jaguar XJ and started giving us a tour of the neighborhood. Most of the conversation was directed at Susan. Mom and Dad eagerly remarked on all that had changed since she'd moved to Manhattan. As for me, I was content to gaze at the mansions facing the Atlantic. Apparently, there was some serious money in it. By the time we got back to the Devereux house, it was almost dinner time. The dress code, I had been told, was casual, but I had already guessed that casual meant something different than what I would wear in Brooklyn. So I put on a pair of pants and a knit shirt, over which I threw a sport coat. I felt comfortable until I stepped out into the hallway and saw Elaine and Susan in cocktail dresses that I thought would be appropriate for the Academy Awards. I was about to panic at the thought of embarrassing myself and Susan when Walter showed up. If anything, his clothes were more casual than mine. He hadn't even bothered to put on socks. I was greatly relieved, and when we arrived at the club, it quickly became apparent that this dichotomy was the norm. The women all dressed to impress each other, and the men wore the most casual clothes their wives allowed them to wear. However, I noticed that the logos on the men's clothing were exclusively expensive brands. The dinner was excellent, but the conversation not so much. Susan's mother essentially delivered a monologue filled with gossip about people and families I didn't know. Walter's conversation boiled down to pointing out various men at other tables and telling me how they'd made their fortunes. I recognized a few names from reading the Wall Street Journal, but after a while, I found it hard to pay attention to his enumeration of luxury. The only relief I felt was when Susan turned away from her mother for a moment to wink at me. When we got home, Walter insisted that I go with him to the library to drink brandy after dinner. As we settled into the large leather armchairs, he began to question me about my background and upbringing. "So, you're from Tennessee," he said. "Did you grow up on a farm?" I had to smile. Well, my great-great-grandfather had a farm, but we've been city dwellers ever since. Oh, he said. Then what did your father do? He was a lawyer, I told him. Sure, sure. A music town. He probably did a lot of copyright law, music, lyrics, recording contracts, and the like, Walter pondered aloud. I loved my father and was proud of him and his accomplishments. Actually, no, I said firmly. A lot of his work dealt with constitutional law. He even argued a few cases before the Supreme Court. On the Tennessee Supreme Court? He asked. No, I said. In another. After that, the conversation seemed to stall. I don't know whether Walter didn't believe me or whether he just didn't care. The next afternoon, I was relieved when Susan and I were finally able to get into the rental car and head back toward Manhattan. I felt like I had been on trial the whole time, and I felt like I had lost my case. As I drove, remembering the events of the weekend, Susan started laughing. You should see your face right now. You look like you just got back from a trip to the dentist. Even I had to smile, but I wasn't ready to forgive and forget just yet. Well, you'd look like that too if all you did all weekend was drill your teeth. Are they always like this? She smiled at me. Don't let them get to you. They're just a little over the top. You have to remember that I'm their only child. I looked at her curiously. We'd never discussed her childhood. What was it like growing up in that family? It was actually pretty funny. They had me wrapped around their finger for as long as I can remember. They had all these plans for me, piano lessons, ballet, exclusive girls' schools, and all that. But I didn't like any of that, and I just did what I wanted to do. They always relented and practically let me get away with murder. Whatever I wanted, they'd give it to me. I was pretty spoiled, she said with a laugh. I remember they wanted me to go to high school at some stupid boarding school for young ladies. But I didn't want any part of it, so I ran away the first week and stayed with a college guy I met at a party. They were beyond worried, and when I finally came home, they promised never to try to make me do anything I didn't want to do. Then her face took on a more serious expression. For a while, I was kind of on the outs. But my sophomore year, one of my best friends lost her father in a plane crash. Suddenly, all their money ran out, and she and her mom had to go live with relatives. I realized that if something like that happened to me, I wouldn't be able to take care of myself. So I started taking school seriously and getting good grades. That's how I ended up at Vassar, and that's why I'm where I am now. Then she suddenly grinned mischievously. But I haven't changed completely. I still do what I want and when I want. I was interested in learning a little more about Susan's background. I thought her story explained something about her character. But I was still tormented by the exam I'd been subjected to that weekend, so I steered the conversation back on track. I don't think I made a good impression on your parents that weekend. Oh, she said dismissively. Don't take it personally. They don't think anyone can be good enough for me. Then a gleam appeared in her eyes. But Daddy warned me to get a prenup with you. I sat there trying to digest that last remark. On one hand, the implication that I was some kind of gold digger after the family money pissed me off. Hell, I didn't even know how rich they were until this weekend. But I suddenly realized that she and I hadn't even talked about marriage. Had Susan said something to my dad? Maybe she'd hinted that she'd love a proposal. Suddenly, my heart beat faster. I knew I was head over heels in love with her, but I wasn't sure if she felt the same way about me. Could this be a sign of her true feelings? I reached for her through the center console, and all the way back to Manhattan, we held hands. Unfortunately, I had no real opportunity to find out Susan's feelings on the sensitive subject of marriage because I had to make another trip out west when I got back to work. And no sooner had I returned than she had already gone to Boston for a few days. It was while she was on one of her business trips that I made the decision to propose to her. Daring had already helped me in my relationship with her once before, and I decided to do it again. One day on my lunch break, I went to my bank and opened the safe deposit box. In the velvet box were my grandmother's wedding and engagement rings. She had entrusted them to my mom to give to me for my fiancé. Of course, my mom didn't have that option, But after my parents died, I inherited the rings. I didn't know how much they were worth in today's jewelry market, but the sentimental value of antique jewelry was much more important to me, and I hoped Susan would think the same. Susan didn't arrive from Boston until late Tuesday night, and she was so exhausted that all she wanted to do was go to bed. But before I did, I made her promise to go out with me on Wednesday night. "Do you have another surprise for me, babe?" she asked. "You'll have to wait and see," I replied calmly, even though my pulse was racing. The next night I met her at the office and we took a cab to one of her favorite restaurants to have dinner. Afterward, we went dancing at a club we frequented. We had a good time, but I could tell that Susan was a little disappointed. Finally, when I decided it was time, I grabbed her and pulled her towards the door. I caught a cab and asked the driver to take us to Fifth Avenue between 33rd and 34th Streets. As we drove, Susan asked me where we were going, but I just waved her off. The cab pulled over to the curb, and here we were at the Empire State Building. I ignored Susan's questions again and led her to the elevators, where I pulled out the 2 express passes I'd bought earlier. We walked silently up to the observatory on the 102nd floor. Susan was clearly waiting for an explanation, but I said nothing. We went to the observation deck, and I invited her to come to the fenced edge of the building. She looked out at the sea of lights that was Lower Manhattan, and then turned to me again. "Well, why did you want to—" Then she stopped and took a breath when she saw me drop to one knee and hold out an open jewelry box to her. "Susan Devereux, this is my grandmother's wedding ring. Will you make me the happiest man in the world today by accepting it and becoming my wife?" She froze in shock, but then the campers and other visitors to the site noticed us, and they quickly picked up the chant, "Say yes, say yes." She looked around, then looked at me. Suddenly her eyes flashed and she said, "Let's do it. Yes, let's do it." The crowd applauded, and after I put the ring on her finger, she wrapped her arms around me and kissed me uncontrollably. After that, we had to go back to her apartment so she could tell her neighbors about it. Even though it was well past midnight, she woke up the other 2 Miss Kiters to show off the ring and tell them about my proposal. All 3 of them exchanged excited hugs and whispered while looking at me. I hesitated for a moment, but then Missy and Brianna rushed over to me for hugs and congratulations. When all the excitement subsided, Susan and I retired to her bedroom. She hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear, "Oh, Peter, that was the best surprise ever. Such a cliché. I never would have guessed it." "I'm so glad you're happy, baby," I told her. "Tomorrow we can start discussing wedding plans and—" "No," Susan said firmly. "I don't want to wait. No big wedding in the Hamptons, no engraved invitations, no parties. Tomorrow. Let's go to City Hall tomorrow and get married tomorrow." "But your parents?" I protested. "No," she repeated. "I want to do it now. It'll be great, Peter. Get engaged today and married tomorrow. It's just perfect. Don't worry about my parents. They'll get over it." And that's how we ended up at the Manhattan Marriage Bureau at noon on Thursday. Of course, we learned that to get married in New York, you have to stand in lines and fill out a lot of paperwork, although they now have computerized kiosks that make it easier. After asking all the questions and paying $35, we learned about the mandatory 24-hour waiting period. But that didn't dampen Susan's enthusiasm one bit. "It's even better this way," she said. "We can get married tomorrow afternoon, and Missy and Brianna can come and be my bridesmaids." She had the chisel between her teeth now, and there was no stopping her. To tell you the truth, I didn't mind at all. I would be happy to take part in any ceremony that would make Susan happy, but if she was willing to forego a formal wedding, so much the better. I had no close family members who would be offended by not attending my wedding, and I knew my friends would be just as happy after reading about it on Facebook. But I specifically called Mickey and Beth, and they both promised to come. So on Friday afternoon, after taking time off work, I arrived at the bridal bureau in my best suit and tie, with Mickey and Beth brought along as witnesses. We arrived a few minutes early, and I had the pleasure of watching Susan take the stage. It was obvious that she wasn't sticking to tradition. She was wearing a black dress instead of white, and a large hat pulled over one eye. Brianna and Missy flanked her, each wearing identical white dresses. How they managed to coordinate their outfits, I'll never know, but it seemed to me, and probably many other onlookers, that the three of them could have starred in a music video as well as a wedding. The ceremony itself was very short. After all, the clerk's office has a schedule to keep. After we solemnly vowed to leave everyone else behind, I kissed my new bride, and the deed was done. I heard a loud pop and saw Beth holding the bottle of champagne she had brought with her. I was surprised to see tears in her eyes, but I guess all women cry at weddings, even lesbians. We needed to get out of the way to give the next couple a chance to get married, so we walked out into the hallway. No one had realized to bring champagne glasses, so we just drank from the bottle in celebration. When the excitement subsided, Mickey walked in with the keys to the zip car he picked up for me. We all walked out to Worth Street, where the car was illegally parked, and I helped my new wife get in. As we pulled away from the curb, Susan carelessly tossed a bouquet of flowers out the window and into Beth's astonished hands. I guess it's one of those old superstitions that won't come true, I laughed. Niagara Falls. As I drove west toward the Holland Tunnel, Susan turned in her seat to face me. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Just be patient," I told her. "It's another surprise." I had already told her to pack a bag for the short honeymoon, but I hadn't told her where we were going. I was determined to surprise her again since she liked them so much. We headed north on I-81 and made it to Syracuse before turning west on I-90. It wasn't until we got to Buffalo that Susan realized where we were going. "Oh my gosh," she said, bursting into laughter. "We're going to spend our honeymoon in Niagara Falls." She guessed right. It seemed to me that the only way to transcend the cliché of a marriage proposal atop the Empire State Building would be a honeymoon in the self-proclaimed honeymoon capital of the world. Susan loved the idea. She couldn't wait to tell Missy and Brianna where we were going. But she was even more excited when she found out where we would be staying. I went on the website looking for the perfect place, and I was sure I had found it. When we stopped under a heart-shaped neon sign that read, "Vacations for Lovers," she laughed out loud. And when the greasy bellhop unlocked the door to our room, she could barely contain herself. It was a honeymoon suite with an in-room jacuzzi and a huge heart-shaped bed covered in pink satin sheets. "It's perfect," she screamed. "Absolutely perfect." Despite the long weekend, we had a wonderful honeymoon. We got out of that ridiculous bed to see Niagara Falls and Horseshoe Falls, and even got soaked riding the Maid of the Mist under the spray. Even though Niagara Falls is dirty and over-commercialized, the area around to Lake Ontario is beautiful, and we enjoyed driving through the countryside. Manhattan. We were tired but happy as we made the long drive back to Manhattan. Once back at the apartment, we unpacked and fell into bed. After a long weekend of honeymooning, sleep was the only thing on our minds. "Good night, Mrs. Morrison," I whispered, cuddling her head. "Thank you, baby." "What a wonderful surprise," she murmured as she drifted into sleep. When we woke up the next morning, Missy and Brianna had already left for work. I had purposely taken another day off to not only rest, but also to move clothes and other things. As I was getting the load into the apartment, it seemed like a good time to broach a potentially touchy subject with Susan. "When are Missy and Brianna going to move out?" I asked. "Why would they want to?" she asked. "Well," I stammered, "you know, now that we're married, I just assumed they'd—" "Oh no," she said. "I can't ask them to leave. Where would they go?" I had no ready answer to that question. "But wouldn't they hate it if we lived here together?" I asked, trying to find a convincing argument. "No," she replied dismissively. "You and I have practically been living together for months now, and it hasn't been a problem. Besides, the three of us were together back in college. We can't stop now." I didn't really like her answer, but I decided to remain silent. It was clear to me that while Susan loved excitement and surprises, she wasn't particularly fond of change. I hoped that in time she would change her mind, or we would move and the problem would resolve itself. The idea of having two Nubian women living in a New York apartment with my wife might have seemed like a teenager's dream, but the reality was quite different. In fact, they both acted as if I wasn't here. I don't mean that they were rude or hostile, just that they went about their daily lives as if nothing had changed. It wasn't unusual for them to strut around the apartment in their underwear, and while I enjoyed the sight, they showed no seductive intentions. Rather, I was a new piece of furniture to them, to which they quickly became accustomed. At meals, we had intimate conversations. The rest of the time, I was barely noticed, just occasional whispers and giggles from the three of us. I noticed that this often happened the morning after Susan and I had noisily made love. I expected her parents wouldn't stand for it when they found out what we were doing, but Susan didn't care. I listened as she called them in the evening when we got back. "Mommy, guess what I did last weekend?" she said nonchalantly. It was clear from half the conversation that Mom and Dad weren't happy, but Susan didn't chicken out. After half an hour, she hung up the phone saying, "I love you too, Mommy." "So," I asked, "how did they take it?" "They were upset," she admitted, "but they'll get over it. They'll never be able to not be angry with me." As the weeks and months went by, Susan and I quickly settled into our new life together. In truth, the new routine wasn't much different from the old one, only our marital status had changed. I continued to fly to the West Coast frequently, but now my work status had changed. I had been promoted to the head of the network security group, and I was feeling pretty good about my career. I tried to keep in touch with Mickey and Beth, although inevitably I didn't see them as often as I used to. At least I was able to help them when I moved. One of my workmates needed an apartment, and I referred him to my old place. He moved in a week after I left, so Mickey and Beth weren't hurt financially by my sudden departure. If there was any stress in my life, it had to do with my desire to make my bride happy and fun. As you can imagine, it's not easy to constantly come up with new and unexpected entertainment. Our busy work and travel schedules were not conducive to this, and the gaps between surprises inevitably grew longer. Nevertheless, when I managed to pull one off, Susan enjoyed it almost physically. My little surprises clearly appealed to her impulsive nature, and the pleasure she derived from them encouraged me to keep trying. Our wedding anniversary was approaching, and I definitely wanted to do something special and unique as part of our celebration, but coming up with something appropriate was proving difficult. I was returning from the coast on a red-eye flight, and since I can't sleep on airplanes, I used that time to think about what I could do that would really wow Susan. The fact that she was expecting something made it even harder. My flight was delayed due to a powerful storm system passing through the central U.S., so I didn't arrive at JFK Airport until the next morning. I was completely exhausted, so I called the office and told them I was taking the day off. When I got to the apartment, it was empty. All three girls had already left for work. I threw my bags on the floor and collapsed on the bed. But despite my tiredness, my internal clock kept me awake, and I lay on the bed looking up at the ceiling, while in my head I was still looking for a way to surprise Susan. Suddenly, an idea popped into my head. Eager to test it out, I started to pull my laptop out of my bags when I noticed that Susan had left her personal computer on. Usually she is meticulous about turning it off after she finishes work, but this morning before leaving for work, she had apparently been checking something and forgot to do so. I tapped the mouse and the screensaver disappeared, revealing a Google News window. There she is, my faithful wife, thought I. I switched to Google search, but the search queries yielded nothing useful. Without thinking, I clicked on the close command. Suddenly, I found myself looking at another window that Susan had left open. I was struck by the familiar logo at the top of the screen. Eye contact. I wondered why Susan would want to go to the eye contact page. Underneath the eye contact banner was a box that read, "Thank you for renewing your annual eye contact membership. We look forward to introducing you to exciting new prospects that match your interests and desires." I sat stunned. It couldn't mean what I thought it meant. Surely she wasn't looking for other men. I quickly opened her basket to see what I could find there. It was empty. She had emptied it recently, perhaps even this morning. I went back to her browser and clicked on the Show All Downloads button. As I expected, the screen was blank. If there were any downloads there, she had obviously moved them to the recycle garbage can and then emptied it. But I knew the Google Chrome browser well and knew that clicking the Clear All button doesn't actually delete downloads. So I went back and opened the Windows Downloads folder, and aghast. It was filled with profile after profile from iContact. She had downloaded dozens of them. I displayed them in date sequence. A quick glance showed that there was a new profile about every 2 weeks. I switched to looking at file names, and the profiles were sorted alphabetically. Sure enough, on the M list was Morrison. I clicked on it and saw the picture Beth had captured of me almost a year ago. I went back to looking at the date sequence. The earliest profiles were from before I had even met her. To my horror, the most recent one was dated yesterday. I opened it, and a handsome, red-haired stranger was staring at me. I was about to close the form when I noticed that this person did not live in New York, but in Boston. Susan was supposed to fly to Boston tomorrow. Some part of me kept urging calm. There must be some innocent answer, some reason why this didn't mean that what the other part of me, the part that was sick and tormented, feared was true, that my beautiful bride was seeing other men. For a moment, I thought I was going to get physically sick. My stomach twisted and twisted, and if I really needed to induce vomiting, I wouldn't be able to make it to the bathroom because I had no strength in my legs. Gradually, however, a calmness came over me and my stomach calmed down. I regained my ability to think and began to consider what to do next. In my heart, I knew the answer, but when confronted by Susan, I needed hard evidence. And the first thing I did was to get a flash drive out of my briefcase and copy all the profiles stored in Susan's downloads folder and transfer them to my laptop. I then returned Susan's computer to the state it was in when I got home. I then booted up my own computer and used it to search for detective agencies. Finally, I tidied up the apartment so that there was no trace of my stay. Walking out onto the sidewalk, I called the detective agency I found. Yes, they told me, one of their operatives would be happy to meet with me. Arriving at the agency, I experienced a vague disappointment. I half expected to see some rundown and smoky place with detectives with the last names Spade and Archer. Instead, the reception area I entered would have been quite appropriate for a law firm, and the detective who came out to greet me was a well-dressed woman. Despite her corporate appearance, Miss Martin's calm, professional demeanor put me at ease, and I told her the whole story. She took extensive notes, and when I mentioned the latest profile, she took a thumb drive from me and copied the files from it to her computer. She also copied Susan's profile, which was still on my laptop. Finally, she looked up from her notes. So, Mr. Morrison, what exactly do you want us to find out for you? I had already decided. At this point, all I really need is to find out what Susan is doing in Boston tomorrow night. If my suspicions are correct, that will be enough. If not, we'll move on. She nodded. Very well, we should be able to give you a full report on her activities by tomorrow afternoon. As I left the agency's office, I was impressed with their professionalism. I also appreciated the fact that Miss Martin didn't jump to any conclusions or try to allay my concerns. Her approach was completely businesslike. The facts spoke for themselves. From the lobby of the building, I called Susan and was grateful when I got her voicemail. Hey babe, just wanted to let you know that I'll be stuck in Mountain View for a couple more days. Hope you get to Boston safely. I'll see you Friday afternoon. Love you. That last lie didn't come easy to me. Then I made another call. Mickey, can I come see you? And I don't know what my face looked like, but when Mickey and Beth saw me, they sat me down on the couch and Beth gave me a comforting hug. Then it all came spilling out. What I had found, what I was afraid of, and what I had done about it. Mickey was horrified and couldn't believe it, but Beth just shook her head. I knew she never really loved Susan, and looking back, I think she was right. We discussed possibilities and made plans until they both had to go to work. Everything, of course, depended on what the detective agency found. But if Mickey was still holding out hope, Beth had no doubts, and unfortunately, neither did I. And it turned out that their other roommate was out of town, and I stayed the night in his bed. The next day, I got up and went to work as usual. It was strange to walk the old route and take the same subway after such a long break. Early in the morning, I got a call from Miss Martin at the detective agency. She said I could come by for their report in the afternoon if I wanted to. I told her I'd be there at 3 o'clock sharp. Riding up in the elevator after lunch, I experienced waves of conflicting emotions. One moment, I felt like a patient headed for surgery. The next moment, I felt wings of hope on my face, urging me to believe that this was all some silly misunderstanding on my part. I didn't have to wait long to find out which one was right. As soon as I sat down in Miss Martin's office, she reached into her desk and pulled out a printed report bound in one of those very homemade covers. "Mr. Morrison," she said without preamble, "I regret to inform you that your suspicions about your wife were well-founded. Our Boston operative had your wife under surveillance from the moment she descended in the hotel elevator yesterday morning throughout the workday, and then returned to the hotel after she left the office." I flipped through the report and saw a picture of Susan in the hotel lobby. She was wearing one of her business suits. The time on the photo was 6:30 p.m. The detective went on to say. She then went up to her room, apparently to freshen up and change her clothes. About an hour later, she returned to the lobby where she was met by her companion for the evening. I turned the page and saw Susan emerging from the elevator in a halter-style dress. That's a lot of cleavage for a business dinner, I thought glumly. Turning the next page, I saw her dinner companion. It was the same red-haired man I'd seen in the eye contact profile. He was kissing her on the cheek as a friendly greeting. The operative followed them to a restaurant where they had a few drinks and then dinner, Miss Martin continued. From there, they went to a nightclub where they drank some more and danced for several hours. The photograph on the next page was dark. It had obviously been taken in low light. Nevertheless, there was no doubt that it was Susan and Red dancing, and they were caught in the middle of what looked like a kiss. Afterwards, Miss Martin calmly narrated, they caught a cab and returned to the hotel, where they proceeded to Susan's room. The photograph showed part of the interior of the elevator. Although the door was already closing, you could still see the couple inside to recognize them. They were hugging, and I noticed Red's hand went under Susan's skirt. The time was listed as 11:45 p.m. The next morning, said the detective, the lady's companion went down the elevator alone and caught a cab about 7:30 a.m. The lady's companion went down the elevator and caught a cab. Mrs. Morrison came down about an hour later. She checked out of the hotel and took a cab back to the office where she worked. In the last picture, Susan, dressed in a woman's business suit, was being helped into the cab by the hotel doorman. I looked up at the detective. "So you have no actual evidence of what went on in the room during the night?" I asked. She looked at me calmly. "We are very thorough, Mr. Morrison. For a handsome fee, which you will find in your bill, we were able to gain access to Mrs. Morrison's room while she was at work yesterday. We installed a motion-sensitive spy camera in the room. After Mrs. Morrison checked out this morning, we were able to retrieve it. At the end of the folder, you'll find a CD of the evening's activities." I flipped through the booklet to the end and started to pull the CD out of my sleeve when Miss Martin reached across the desk and stopped me. "Mr. Morrison, we strongly advise our clients not to view videos like this one. You already know what happened in the room, and the video will not add to your new knowledge. What it will do, though, is create emotionally charged images that you won't be able to forget. Trust me, this is one of those cases where it's better to know a little than a lot." I pulled my hand away. I had to decide whether or not to watch the video later, but I felt the truth in her words. How much longer did I want to suffer? We sat in silence for a minute, then she spoke. "Mr. Morrison, after receiving confirmation of a spouse's infidelity, a surprisingly large percentage of our clients are willing to consider reconciliation. Do you think you might be inclined to do so?" I didn't have to think about the answer. "Absolutely not. For one thing, we haven't even been married a year, and she's already sleeping with other people. How can I forgive that? Secondly, this wasn't some sudden affair. She chose this guy and got involved with him. And worst of all, I know damn well he wasn't the only one. There were 37 profiles in her computer, and I'll bet she had fun with every one of them. Miss Martin was not discouraged by my outburst. I understand, Mr. Morrison. If I were in your shoes, I would feel exactly the same way. But I had to ask. She paused. Now let me ask another question. Do you have legal representation? No, I shook my head. I guess I haven't grown up to it yet. Truth be told, I didn't even know any lawyers. In that case, I'll be happy to refer you to a lawyer we've worked with many times in the past. He is honest and reasonable. Besides, he has the advantage of being in the same building. I figured the detective agency must get some sort of commission or fee for every client they referred to an attorney, but frankly, I didn't care. I was on assignment now, and I needed to hurry. Can you get me an appointment with him today? I asked. I returned to Brooklyn in the evening with a personal folder stuffed in an envelope and my new lawyer's business card. When I got to the apartment, Mickey had already left, but Beth had the day off and was able to listen to all the details. When it came to the disc, I was still hesitant whether to watch it or not. Beth surprised me. She volunteered to preview it and then advise me. She disappeared into her room, closing the door behind her. I had already washed my face and changed into jeans and a t-shirt when she reappeared. I was amazed to see tears in her eyes. She hugged me and said quietly, "Don't watch this. I can see how hurt you are right now. It will only make it worse." I decided to take her advice. There was no doubt about what I was going to do. Now the only thing I cared about was focusing on the details and getting it right. I didn't want any distractions. When Mickey returned, the three of us talked some more about what I was up to. I would have to rely on the two of them to keep everything organized and pay attention to detail, but they were already talking about it as if it was their plan, and I was just a fellow traveler. They seemed to take what happened to me to heart, and that really touched me. Columbus Circle. I returned to Susan's apartment on Friday afternoon with bags in hand, as if I had just arrived from the airport. When I unlocked the door and walked in, the three miscatchers were sitting on the couch, whispering and giggling. When I entered the room, Susan jumped up, ran across the room, and jumped into my arms, while Brianna and Missy giggled. "Oh, baby, I missed you so much," Susan exclaimed, kissing me frantically. Then she pulled away and looked at me slyly. "You know it's our anniversary this weekend, right?" she asked. "How could I forget?" I replied calmly. "And before you ask, yes, I do have a surprise for you, but you'll have to wait until Sunday to get it." Susan was so excited she even trembled. "Oh, I can't wait that long. Come on, baby, at least give me a hint. What are you planning?" "No," I said firmly. "My lips are sealed. You'll have to wait." The rest of the evening went fine, except that Susan kept whispering with Missy and Brianna while we relaxed in front of the TV. I guessed they were either speculating about what Sunday would bring or making comparisons between me and Red. Either way, I paid them no attention. When it was time to go to bed, Susan wanted entertainment, as she usually did when one of us returned from one of our trips. But given what I'd learned about her activities while in Boston, I figured I'd never touch her again. So when she started rubbing herself against me, I firmly pushed her away. "No, baby, not today, and not tomorrow. It's all part of the surprise. You'll just have to be celibate until Sunday." I think she was shocked at this turn of events, and I knew she was upset because she always waited for me when I came back from California. However, wanting to give her a big surprise equally tugged at her emotions, and eventually she settled down and fell into a restless sleep. Saturday was an equally disappointing day for her. She must have instructed Missy and Brianna to get some clue from me, because whenever Susan wasn't around, one or the other of them volunteered to help with the surprise in any way they could. But I would calmly tell them that it was already done and no help was needed. Then I further irritated them by informing them that they would be part of the surprise. This got them talking excitedly, and when Susan returned, they couldn't wait to tell her about the new event. She, for her part, could hardly keep still, acting like a little girl on Christmas Eve. That evening, I did nothing to give them any hint or pleasure. Instead of going out, I offered to order takeaway, and not wanting to leave me alone to do any cooking while they were away, they reluctantly stayed with me. As we were getting ready for bed, I sensed that the conflict within Susan had reached a breaking point. She was still looking forward to her surprise. She tried her best to seduce me, but I remained adamant. "Come on, Susan. You know you don't want to ruin the surprise." That stopped her, and she pouted and went to sleep. The next morning, I knew I had to tell them something, or I would be in danger of a riot, so at breakfast I gave them some instructions. I told them we had to leave the apartment at 12:30 sharp. No special clothes were required, no bags were to be packed, and we would all go in the same cab. Having laid out these preconditions, I left them in fervent contemplation, and myself went downstairs and outside to make a quick phone call to Mickey. He assured me that everything was fine. "Just be there on time, relax, and enjoy the show," he told me. At 12:30, I brought all three of us downstairs. The doorman found us a cab, and I slipped him a $50 tip. He was surprised, but I liked the guy and figured I'd probably never see him again. The three girls moved to the back of the cab, and I sat in the front with the driver. This allowed me to lean over and tell him where we were going without the three miscatchers being able to hear me. This caused a commotion, which I ignored with a smile. Despite the traffic, we reached our destination a few minutes early. The girls got out of the cab in some confusion, looking up at the imposing figure of Christopher Columbus towering above them. "Why are we on Columbus Alley?" Brianna asked. Asked Brianna. "Is this where the surprise is going to be?" With a smile on my face, I led them to the base of the statue and made them sit on the wide steps on one side. Columbus Circle was filled with tourists and passers-by, some taking pictures, some strolling around enjoying the sunny weather. At that moment, some man approached the three girls from behind and placed a large object on the ledge above them. I recognized him. It was an old-fashioned boombox. He flicked a switch. Suddenly, a rhythmic drumbeat came from the speakers, startling the girls and attracting the attention of many people in the circle and beyond. As the drumming continued, several passers-by began to gather in a circle that stretched around the entire perimeter of the monument. I didn't hear a command, but they suddenly began dancing as one, performing a modified version of the famous Rockets number from Radio City Music Hall. The drumming then moved to the hit song, "The One That Got Away." I could see Susan clapping enthusiastically. Katy Perry was one of her favorite pop artists, and this song was her current top 10 hit. As the dancers strutted out in front of Susan, Missy, and Brianna, Katy's sweet voice sang the chorus. "In another life, I'd be your girlfriend. We'd have kept all our promises. We'd be us against the world." The tourists clapped and cheered as the clearly spontaneous entertainment continued. The three girls sat grinning and laughing. I knew Susan liked it. She always liked being the center of attention. As the dancers continued to dance around the statue, one of them came out from the side behind the girls, carrying a poster of a man, which he showed first to the crowd and then to the girls. "Is this the one who escaped?" wondered the crowd. Then another dancer appeared with a poster with another man's face, followed by another, then another, and another. Susan laughed merrily at the spectacle, but Missy suddenly frowned and leaned over to shout in Brianna's ear, pointing to the pictures that were swirling in front of them. Apparently, she recognized one of the dates Susan had been arranging. In fact, all the faces the dancers held up were profile pictures of Susan's favorites. The next poster that appeared caused even more confusion among Susan's friends. Brianna began tugging and yelling at Susan, gesturing for her to look more closely at this last poster. Suddenly, Susan's head popped up, realizing what Brianna was saying. She started moving around, trying to get a better look at all the pictures the dancers were carrying. Her excitement spiked when she spotted the last picture. It was the red-haired man she had spent the night with in Boston earlier that week. As the song moved to bridge, the group of dancers continued to dance and kick back, each holding their poster in full view. "All this money can't buy me a time machine. No, no. Can't replace you with a million rings. No, no. I should have told you what you mean to me. Uh-oh. 'Cause now I'm paying the price. At this point, all the dancers threw their placards on the ground. Then Mickey and Beth came out from behind the statue, holding one poster each with pictures of Susan and me on it. When they reached a point directly in front of the three seated girls, whose faces turned pale even in the bright afternoon sunlight, Katy Perry's voice came again in a chorus. In another life, I would have made you stay, so you wouldn't have to talk. You were the one who left, the one that got away. As the refrain repeated itself, Mickey and Beth each pulled a different part of the poster, and it suddenly split in two, separating my image from Susan's. They then threw each half to the ground. The crowd was confused. The dancers stopped and the performance seemed to be over, but the tape recorder was still playing the last line of the chorus, seemingly in an endless loop. And instead of the laughter they expected to see from the three girls who were clearly the center of attention, they were crying and hugging each other in obvious distress. A few people started to clap, but they were drowned out by the people around them who wanted to see what else could happen. When the last line of the song looped, the circle of dancers parted, and I briskly strode forward. I walked right up to Susan, and when she looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, I handed her a copy of my divorce petition. "Susan Devereux Morrison, you've been served with a summons," I shouted. As I turned to leave, Susan jumped to her feet and tried to follow me, but Mickey turned and scowled, and his 6'5" of height startled her so much that she sobbed and sank to the steps while her girlfriends tried to comfort her. But the last word belonged to Beth. She walked up to Susan with a fierce expression on her face. "You bitch!" she shouted. "You had a good man, but now, thank God, he's run away!" The music died down, the dancers dissolved into the crowd, and the other passers-by were silent in embarrassment. The only sound was the crying of the three girls sitting humiliated at the feet of Christopher Columbus. Mickey escorted Beth and me to a waiting cab, and the three of us set off for Brooklyn. I was tempted to go back and ask Susan how she liked the surprise, but I decided that would be unnecessary. Susan repeatedly tried to contact me, but I steadfastly refused to return her calls, emails, and texts. I waited until her high-profile attorney contacted mine, after which I gave him my terms. I was only willing to talk to Susan if we met to agree on the division of property. After much negotiation, we finally agreed on a date and time for the meeting. It was to be held at Susan's law firm's office. My lawyer didn't like it, but by then, he was already pretty unhappy with me. I didn't care. We were ushered into a conference room the size of Susan's apartment. I think my lawyer was intimidated, but I knew I was in control of the situation, so it didn't bother me. The only thing that surprised me was that Walter, Susan's father, was sitting next to my daughter. I should have known that, I thought to myself. Surely he must have had to bail her out of trouble more than once. When we were all seated, I looked across the table at them. Susan's lawyer was looking at me as if I were some strange bug he'd discovered under a microscope. Walter looked at me reproachfully. He couldn't bear the fact that I had hurt his precious daughter. As for Susan, she didn't want to look at me at all. Finally, Susan's lawyer spoke. "Well, Mr. Morrison, we are all gathered here today at your insistence to discuss the division of property in connection with the dissolution of this marriage. We have a proposal that I think you will find more than fair. Perhaps we should start there." My lawyer cleared his throat and began to speak, but I interrupted him. "Forget it," I said firmly. Walter Devereux leaned over to his daughter and tried to whisper in her ear, but I could hear him clearly. "I told you to make him sign a prenup." Her lawyer was confused by this exchange and tried to turn our attention to the proposed agreement. Once again, I was unsuccessful. "Drop it," I told him. I turned to Walter. "Mr. Devereux, I married your daughter for love, not money. I doubt a man like you is capable of understanding that, but my father raised me to believe that a man's honor is far more important than his wealth." Then I turned to Susan's lawyer again. "There are two things I want as part of the settlement, and if you agree to them, I will be very happy to conclude these negotiations without any other demands or conditions. I heard Walter mutter grudgingly to himself, "This is it. This is it." First of all, I want Susan to return my grandmother's wedding and engagement rings. They symbolize a commitment to share our lives together, leaving everyone else behind, and we all know now that Susan did not and never intended to make such a commitment. I watched as Susan put her head down on the table and began to cry. The second thing I need is 30 minutes alone with Susan, during which time she will promise to answer my questions truthfully. Give me those two things, and I will waive all other claims to this marriage. My lawyer sat shaking his head. He had done his homework on Devereux and probably had an idea of the old man's net worth. He'd been very disappointed when he found out he couldn't get a percent of it. But Walter Devereux suddenly perked up. "Would you mind putting it in writing, young man?" he asked impatiently. I looked at him coldly. "In my family, a man's word is his bond. But for the sake of your family, I will sign such an agreement." My sarcasm flew past his head. He was too busy to have the family lawyer prepare an appropriate contract. Then he turned to Susan. "Give them to him," he ordered. "Give him the damn rings and we'll get out of this mess." As she continued to sob, he patted her hand. "Damn it, baby. If they mean that much to you, Mommy and I will buy you new ones." As she started pulling off the old-fashioned rings, I stood up. "Since we all seem to agree, I'd like everyone but Susan to leave the room. My 30 minutes will begin as soon as you leave." Walter looked at his daughter uncertainly, but then stood up and, grabbing the family lawyer by the arm, pulled him toward the door. "Write up that agreement immediately. I want his signature before he leaves the room." Everyone else left, and Susan and I stayed across the table from each other. I sat there for a minute, not knowing where to start. I had been thinking about it since that day at Columbus Circle, but now I didn't know where to start. In the end, I decided to just take it a step further. "When did it start, Susan?" I asked in a low, even voice. She looked up and realized what I meant. "I guess it never stopped," she said. "Eye Contact kept sending me profiles of all these hot guys, and I guess I just wanted to try them all." "But I thought you loved me," I said. "I did, Peter. I really did. But when we'd go out and you'd go out of town, I'd get bored and want to have fun. It didn't seem right to me to try alternatives, especially since I was sure you'd never find out." "So why did you agree to marry me if you had such feelings?" "Oh, Peter, it was so beautiful when you took me to the Empire State Building and proposed on the roof. I've never had a man who cared for me so much. It was all so exciting that I just decided to say yes. I knew Mom and Dad would be furious, but it just added to the thrill." I paused to digest what I'd said. "So how long was it after your honeymoon before you started eye contact again?" "Babe, I promised myself I'd be faithful to you after we got married. But then you had to go back to the West Coast, and it was boring sitting around doing nothing. Then I got a new batch of questionnaires from Eye Contact, and it reminded me how exciting it is to meet a new man for the first time. I really missed it, baby, but I didn't do anything about it because I didn't want to hurt you. Then I found out I had to move back to Boston in another week, and I realized Boston was a whole different world. I changed my Eye Contact profile to Boston, and of course they sent me a new batch of profiles. And when I went there," her voice broke. We both knew what she'd done. I tried to think back to the days immediately following our wedding. I remembered exactly the first trip to the West Coast after our honeymoon because I couldn't wait to get back to Susan. The timing of her first trip to Boston wasn't as clear, but I don't think it was more than a week or two later. Less than a month after our honeymoon, and she was already cheating on me. "So every time you went to Boston?" I left the question unanswered, and she only nodded guiltily. I decided to take a different route. "What about Missy and Brianna?" I asked. "Did they know?" "Oh, yes," she said. "We'd been together so long that neither of us had any secrets from each other." "And they didn't care?" I asked. "Oh, no, they benefited." And then she stopped abruptly. But I had already guessed what she was talking about. "So you handed your men over to them," I suggested. After you had your first taste, you gave them to Missy and Brianna. She blushed. Well, not that there was anything wrong with them, she said. 3 Missy kidders, I thought. More like 3 little sluts. No wonder they didn't want to share their happy little family. I turned to her again. One last question, Susan. Why? Why did you have all those men? Why couldn't you stop? Why couldn't you just love me? I don't really know, she whispered. When I got to Vassar, I was voted the most beautiful woman among the freshmen. It was great at first. I liked all the attention. Then, one of the upperclassmen wanted me to be a regular. It was fun at first, but then it turned into a chore, and I dumped him. I tried a relationship with another guy, and the same thing happened. By then I realized what the problem was. I loved the excitement of being with a new man. Being with a guy for the first time is like going on a ride. Every time is a surprise. After that, I dated a different guy almost every week, and I loved it. She looked at me slyly. Missy and Brianna liked it too. Anyway, she continued, when I graduated, my dad found me a job at an investment bank. The job was great, but the hours were long and most of the guys in the office were married, so I didn't have many opportunities. I tried going to singles bars, but it was so casual. A lot of the guys were real lowlifes. Then I tried online dating, and that worked better. Then I found the eye contact site, and most of its members were top-notch. Every week, new profiles appeared in my inbox. It was like my own personal buffet. As she spoke, she became more animated. I stood up. The half hour wasn't up yet, but I had already heard everything I wanted to hear. She stood up when she saw me standing. Baby, I know I hurt you badly, but I love you. You're really special. I know this isn't a traditional marriage, but if you could get over my little need, we could be so happy together. Things could be really good, baby. I could even set you up with Missy and Brianna if you want. My stomach hurt, but before I could say anything, Susan's father and her lawyer entered the room, accompanied by my attorney. Attorney Devereaux handed me a piece of paper and a pen. I believe this agreement covers exactly what you wanted, Mr. Morrison, and your attorney has no objections. I looked at him and he nodded. I reached across the table and took my grandmother's rings and slipped them into my pocket. Then I took the proffered pen and signed and dated the document. When I stood up, I saw Walter Devereaux looking at me curiously. I may have misjudged you, young man, he said, and held out his hand. Quite possibly, I replied. I have certainly misjudged your daughter, but I believe my assessment of you is correct. With those words, I ignored his hand and walked out the door. I was lucky. The Google guy who lived with Mickey and Beth was transferred, and I was able to move in with them. It was great at their place. They both cared a lot about my feelings and emotions, and whenever I was feeling particularly sad, which was often, they would try to find a way to cheer me up. The day my divorce was final, they threw a big party at the club where Mickey worked. I was probably the only straight guy in the crowd, but I still enjoyed myself. Despite their best efforts, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was a loser. I tried playing the dating game and lost. I tried love and marriage and lost again. Even moving in with Mickey and Beth felt like a loss, but not because of them, but because I was back where I started. I saw Susan once. I had to attend a meeting downtown that ran late into the night. By the time it was over, I was hungry, so I went into a small establishment that had a lot of light and noise. I realized I needed more of that in my life, so I went in and sat down at a table to order my food. I spotted her at the far end of the hall. She was laughing and flirting with a cute guy a couple years younger than me. I lost my appetite and left. She never saw me. I had no reason to expect her to change, but the fact that she hadn't changed depressed me even more. So I guess I must have matured after a few weeks when I got a call from a recruitment agency. If you work at a hot company like Google, calls from headhunters are pretty common. This guy was looking for someone to fill the position of head of network security at a large hospital chain. At the time, there was a huge push to digitize medical records so that different departments and specialists could easily share them. Now, Hospitals are just starting to think about how this will affect network security. It sounded interesting enough, but what caught my attention was that the job was in Nashville. My old hometown had become one of the leading centers for hospital management. I wonder what Walter Devereux would say about that, thought I wryly. They made me an offer, and I decided to take it. New York had already lost its flavor for me, and this offer came at just the right time. It was time to move on. And looking at my bags lying on the floor in the living room of our apartment, I was surprised at how little stuff I had. I bet I'm the cheapest reloader in this company, I thought with amusement. The only difficult part of the move was parting ways with Mickey and Beth. They had seemed so different when I met them, and now they had become painfully dear. I reached out to shake Mickey's hand, but he enclosed me in a bear hug that reminded me of how big and strong he really was. "Don't forget us, Peter," he said solemnly. "We won't forget you." I was about to say something snide, but I couldn't do it. "I won't forget you, kid. I promise," I vowed to him. Then I turned to Beth and saw the tears in her eyes again. I couldn't speak for fear I'd start crying too, so I reached up to kiss her cheek. To my surprise, she turned her head so that I kissed her on the lips. She then hugged me tightly, turned away, and ran off to her room. I had no choice but to gather my things and go catch a cab. Nashville all over again. Nashville seemed both foreign and cozy at the same time. I missed the nonstop excitement of the Big Apple, but I loved the southern hospitality of the people in Nashville. Just as importantly, I loved all the greenery. In New York, all you see is concrete except for the occasional tree growing wistfully out of the sidewalk. But in Nashville, grass and trees were everywhere. I didn't realize how much I missed it. I ended up buying a century-old house in East Nashville, in an old neighborhood where young families were remodeling. In addition to the bungalow, I now had a couple huge old trees and a small lawn to mow. It was the right thing to do. Once settled, I took the time to resume running, something I had struggled to do in New York. I joined a running club, which gave me the opportunity not only to exercise regularly, but also to meet people with similar interests. Many of them were women, and that's how I gradually got back into the dating scene. That's how I ended up at a nightclub that Saturday night, and my date and I saw a female character performing on stage. She looked up at me. "I don't understand. Why do they have to do this?" I couldn't help but think of Mickey and Beth and remembered how strange and offbeat they seemed when I first met them. But then memories of Susan came back to me, and I realized that she was the bigger mystery. I still didn't understand her and doubted I ever would. I thought back to that night at Grand Central Station and decided that perhaps Lady Gaga's answer fit just fine. I turned to my companion and shrugged. Maybe they were born that way. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.